Today we are having got it. So today we are having the second part of the South Zone webinar of the webinar series that have been organized by WPC and Labor Access. This series of webinar is going to look at the workers' housing policies and practices from the past, present, and then try and create something that is working for the working class. So just to give a background, the COVID pandemic crisis that has happened has really brought to light the extreme injustice and inequity that today Indian cities are having in them. And also, if you look at the data, we see that there's been a significant growth, about 25% of decadal growth in the number of slums, and but 63% of Indian slums, Indian cities have slums in them. So keeping that in mind, and keeping in mind the constituency that WPC works with, which is the informal sector, it was very important to try and understand the extent of access to housing that people have, to dignified, safe, affordable, and adequate housing that they have access to. So through these series of webinars, we're trying to understand what were the existing schemes and practices that are at the state level or at the central level or at the municipal level, trying to understand what are the gaps and limitations that have transpired through the implementation process, and then try and find a way to build a national campaign for working class housing. So what could be in it, and what have to be in it, and how the process also to kind of create it should be applied to. So that is the larger vision of this whole series of webinars that we are organizing. But right now, today, the focus is on the South Zone. We're looking at the states of Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, where we have very, very interesting presentations coming up for everyone. So on that note, I would like to invite our first speaker, who is Ms. Karen Coelho from MIDS. She's the Associate Professor at the Madras Institute of Development Studies. She's an urban anthropologist who has researched the city of Chennai for over 15 years and is studying, among other things, housing and resettlement schemes, informal settlements, mobilities of working class households, and urban ecologies. She's carried out studies for the Tamil Nadu State Planning Commission and the Slum Clearance Board. She has published numerous articles on water politics, urban ecology, informal labor, and housing and resettlement in Chennai. She serves on the editorial advisory board of the Review of Urban Affairs of India's Economic and Political Weekly, EPW, and is the international corresponding editor of Urban Studies. She teaches modules on history of development thought and ethnographic methods at MIDS. Welcome, Karen, and over to you.
Okay, hi, I did not think I was the first. I thought it was Swastik, and I was kind of looking forward to hearing Swastik before I spoke, but here we go. Anyway, good to be here. And as I was telling Anju when she invited me, is that actually by way of worker housing in Tamil Nadu or Chennai, we actually have almost nothing to speak about. So let me talk about that. So yeah, I'll start by saying that really at the moment, there's nothing by way of explicit schemes for worker housing in Chennai, other than generic affordable housing schemes for the urban poor. And this in turn, at least in Chennai, mainly consists of slum clearance schemes implemented by the Tamil Nadu Slum Clearance Board, which is now renamed the Tamil Nadu Urban Habitat Development Board, in the form of massive ghetto-type tenements on the peripheries of the city, which have yielded a whole set of problems. And Vanessa is going to talk about those problems, so I won't go into detail about that. What I'll do instead is outline the overall scenario of affordable housing in Chennai and how this has changed over time. So I think what's interesting is that Tamil Nadu and Chennai have been leaders in implementing social or affordable housing. You know, in India, they have sort of been pioneers and leaders at a very substantial scale, not only since the World Bank funded MUDP projects of the 70s and 80s, but from even earlier. In fact, Madras had a reputation of being a slum city almost since its formation. And you had a lot of hutment grounds, squatter settlements, and slums in its early territories. And this need to provide housing for waves of migrants that poured into the city, even from the early 20th century, made affordable housing a very key planning concern ever since the first town planning schemes in the early 1900s. And all of this also accounts for the historically strong role of the state in housing for low-income households in Tamil Nadu. And the Tamil Nadu Slum Clearance Board, established in 1971, was the first such institution in the country. So you have this very strong role of the state. And from as early as the 1950s, the Madras Corporation and the City Improvement Trust actively developed housing colonies for slum dwellers on land acquired by the state. And by this time, they had also begun to construct tenements for housing for slum dwellers. This gathered momentum after the DMK's rise to power in the 1960s on the back of promises to eradicate slums by building houses for the poor at the rate of about 5,000 tenements a year, which is the promise they had made. And of course, this kind of approach proved unsustainable, unsurprisingly. And after about 10 years, the board had succeeded in rehousing only about 17% of the over 2 lakh slum households in Chennai at that point. So what follows, I think, is fairly well known. The affordable housing landscape in Chennai was transformed by the entry of the World Bank into Tamil Nadu in the 1970s, bringing substantial funding into Chennai's urban housing sector. And the bank's principles of affordability, cost recovery, and replicability steered the government's housing policies away from tenement construction and towards self-help approaches, which were realized through the MUDPs, which were funded by the World Bank and implemented between 1977 and 1988. So these MUDP programs produced affordable housing through 2 kinds of schemes: sites and services schemes and in-situ slum upgradation. Both schemes provided tenure security, basic infrastructure, and loans to slum dwellers, leaving them to construct their own houses. The sites and services schemes resettled slum dwellers in plots within large service sites on state-acquired land on the edges of the city. 13 such schemes comprising about, I think, 50,000 units were implemented between 1977 and the early 1990s. Although they focused on EWS and LIG households, these schemes actually catered to a mixed socioeconomic group, and they cross-subsidized EWS plots by selling MIG plots at market rates, and they created integrated neighborhoods. The MUDPs were an important landmark actually in Chennai's housing history, because despite their neoliberal agenda of removing direct state provisioning and reducing subsidies in housing, they chalked up significant achievements in the scale and reach of affordable housing, covering about 76,000 slum households in the 10 years or 15 years where they worked. And a couple of recent studies have actually found that they've been very successful in ensuring decent housing and socioeconomic mobility for low-income households in the long run. Our own study in 2016 compared the outcomes of 4 models of slum clearance in Chennai after about 25 to 30 years, and found that the sites and services projects yielded the most positive outcomes in terms of producing well-serviced and socially integrated urban neighborhoods. And another study in 2016 by Owens et al. Also found that by allowing families to design, build, and incrementally expand their homes as needed, these schemes vastly expanded the supply of affordable housing over time with minimal outlay by the state. By varying plot sizes to cater to different classes, and by ensuring amenities, including industrial and commercial spaces within the sites, they facilitated the emergence of mixed class, mixed use neighborhoods. And despite their peripheral location at the time, these sites were located near existing developments where trunk infrastructure such as roads, water supply, and public transportation were already available. As a result, 20 to 30 years later, they emerged as thriving and inclusive neighborhoods which generated a sense of ownership and community, and I think very importantly, facilitated socioeconomic mobility. But now we find that all of this has been dropped in favor of a growing peripheralization of working class housing in Chennai. So by the late 1990s, we see that the state's approach to slum clearance had shifted almost entirely to demolishing slums and rehousing their residents in large resettlement colonies on cheap tracts of land outside the city. In other words, the Slum Clearance Board's role had reverted from one of enabling self-help housing within integrated neighborhoods to that of evicting slum dwellers from the city and constructing tenements on a large scale, an approach that, as I said earlier, had been rejected as unsustainable already back in the 1970s. So the effects of these housing solutions, that is these large resettlement colonies, in terms of disrupting livelihoods and throwing thousands of workers, particularly women, out of the workforce, are well known. And Vanessa is going to talk more about this, so I won't go into that. But let me say there were two major factors that led to this shift. First, land prices rose very steeply in the late 1990s, following policy changes in Tamil Nadu to liberalize land markets and use real estate values to attract global investment. So this financialization of land, particularly in the peripheries of Chennai, were not only driven by private capital, but were also catalyzed by state-built or sponsored projects, or by public-private partnerships, including things like corridor developments, SEZs, industrial parks, of which, of course, the best known example is the IT corridor in the south of Chennai. So an era of high private industrial and financial investment, particularly in automobile and IT sectors, concentrated in the southern and western peripheries of the city, gave rise to a highly speculative real estate market in these areas and a skyrocketing of land prices in and around Chennai. And all of this combined with a massive uptake of land-intensive infrastructure projects, such as flyovers, road corridors, and mass transit systems, put a halt to the regularization of tenure for in-situ slum improvement or to land acquisition for low-income housing within the city. Second, the availability of substantial funding for slum-free cities programs from the Tamil Nadu Urban Development Project and the Jawaharlal Urban National Renewal Project contributed to the shift back to large-scale housing construction by the state. Over 80% of the funds received under the BSUP of the JNNURM was spent on building resettlement tenements on the urban peripheries. So from 2000 on, nearly 60,000 resettlement tenements have been built in the southern outskirts of Chennai alone. And in the last two to 3 years, another 7,000 units have been built in Ernavur, an area heavily polluted by petroleum and coal industries in North Chennai. So we looked at data for the last 5 years, so from 2014 to 2018, which I think gives us a few insights into the current landscape of affordable housing supply in Chennai. And it highlights two things. One is that given the land and housing market conditions in Chennai, affordable housing is only available far outside the city. And second, that any supply of housing in the affordable housing range is provided only by the government, despite decades of housing policy efforts to draw the private sector into supplying more affordable housing. As I have shown above, this affordable housing then by the state is primarily in the form of slum clearance tenements built by TNSCB. So whether you're talking about worker housing, low-income housing, or affordable housing, all you have in Chennai today are these resettlement ghettos on the peripheries. So I'm just going to take 2 or 3 minutes more to elaborate a bit on what I'm talking about when I say peripheralization of low-income housing. If you go by the now standard definition of affordability, which is 4 to 5 times a household's annual income, an affordable housing unit in Chennai should cost between 8 to 10 lakhs for EWS and 16 to 20 lakhs for LIG households. Of course, one of the problems is that state agencies as well as private builders define affordable housing not by price, but by size, that is units of 300 to 600 square feet. And this approach has contributed to making most so-called affordable units unaffordable to EWS and LIG households. We found that of the total stock of affordable housing produced in the city between 2014 2018, 91% was produced by the state, and of this, the vast majority by the Slum Clearance Board. So against a shortage of about 3 lakh housing units in Chennai, most of it in the low income segment, but these two state agencies produced 1.2 lakh units only, of which TNSCB accounted for 1.16 lakh, so literally the vast majority, while TNHB contributed only 6,000 units. So basically the TNHB has come to focus almost exclusively on middle income and high income housing. And its LIG housing is priced at the same level as private sector units with a median price of 31.3 lakh, putting them, of course, well out of reach, even for LIG families, leave alone EWS. And in terms of the geographies of housing supply, we found that affordable housing had moved increasingly to the edges, not only of the city, but of the larger metropolitan area. Land prices remain as high as 1,000 to 2,000 per square feet, even 20 to 30 kilometers outside the city, especially in the southern and western peripheries. So as I said, even government EWS housing has predominantly been provided in the peripheries, some at the outer edges of the metropolitan area, more than 30 kilometers from the city center. The maps we produce show that 78% of units built for EWS housing between 2014 and 2018 were in these resettlement colonies like Perumbakam, Gudapakam, and Navalur, located more than 30 kilometers, 20 to 30 kilometers from the city center. The private sector supplies affordable housing predominantly through the CMDA's earlier mandate that residential projects over 1 hectare should reserve 10% of their area for low-income housing units, which are defined as units not bigger than 45 square meters. So between 2014 and 2018, this mandate yielded only around 12,000 units, about 9% of the total private sector stock produced. And the median price for these units was 30 lakhs, leaving most of it outside Chennai's affordability ceiling. Again, most of this housing stock was built on the outskirts of the city, and most of the recent market launches in what the market calls affordable housing, that is prices ranging from 20 to 50 lakhs, are located even outside the Chennai metropolitan area. There are very few affordable projects within 30 kilometers from the city, leaving low-income households effectively priced out of the city. So that's kind of the landscape that we have today. And I'll just close with a few lines about the current Tamil Nadu housing and habitat policy, which is it's kind of a moving target because there have been several versions of it produced and presented and rejected. And it appears that another one is currently being drafted. But this set of policies, let's call it, has recognized the need for providing transit rental housing. It's explicitly recognized the need for providing transit rental housing for workers and for diversifying the supply of affordable housing to cater to different types of urban residents, emphasizing rental offerings for industrial workers and migrants, including single women workers. The government has taken a $500 million loan from the ADB for constructing affordable housing units for vulnerable communities and migrant workers. And a new component that has been announced in this year's policy note is the affordable rental housing complex for migrant workers, where public or private agencies will construct, operate, and maintain for 25 years dwelling units or dormitories for workers. This will be funded by the Technical Innovation Grant from the central government, while the urban local body will provide trunk infrastructure. A total of 53,000 units are slated to be built this year in Chennai. This will comprise about 19,000 units in SIPCOT and in the Chennai Petrochemical CPCL in the state sector, and about 22,000 units in the private sector by a developer called SPR City Estates in Sri Perumbudur. And so all of this is in flux, and we will have to wait and see how these solutions are implemented. For now, all we have is resettlement colonies as the major solution for worker housing. I'll close there.
All right. Thank you, Karen. I think we've covered the entire range, ever since independence, and how I think the focus on site and services as a model is something that is really good. But then opportunities of economic opportunities also have to kind of go along with the site and services wherever they're provided. And this peripheralization of housing for the working class is something that we're seeing in all cities across the country. And having a conscious agenda by groups like ours should be to kind of try and find alternatives to kind of push for inclusionary housing in cities, and which is something that I think through ARHC, I think they're trying to find some other ways also to kind of do it. So on that note, I would like to invite Vanessa Peter to come and talk about community participation and community participation in providing housing for people in Tamil Nadu, and also a case of Madurai actually. So a quick introduction of Vanessa. She's a member of the state level project sanctioning committee, which is constituted by the government of Tamil Nadu to clear proposals and to ensure the quality of the program. Currently, she's a member of the Supreme Court appointed a state level committee to monitor the functioning of shelter for urban homeless in Tamil Nadu. Through her policy research and social audits, Vanessa has been striving to bring about pro-poor policies by the government of Tamil Nadu. In 2013, she started the Information and Resource Center for Deprived Urban Communities, a social initiative that seeks to address the disconnect between the poor, policy, and the policymakers. Over to you, Vanessa. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll be basically talking about community participation, why there is a need for it. So one thing that we have understood over our years of working is that the communities are not engaged, especially when it comes to housing. They're the ones who are going to be benefiting out of these programs, but their voices are seldom heard. And it is very important to talk about enhanced community participation, basically because today we are finding that the democratic spaces available are increasingly shrinking. So we need to kind of keep that in mind and keep enforcing that the government should include community in all of its programs, especially the housing program. So we realized through our work that communities are seldom included in the policy formulation processes or in the planning processes. So and one of the key challenges that we've seen in that is the attitude of the bureaucrats and the policymakers themselves. So they see that housing is perceived most often as a charity and not perceived as a right. So they say, okay, we'll construct something and hand it over to you, and you will be, because we are going to give it to you in a subsidized rate or free of cost. So you will have to be happy with whatever we are giving you. That's the kind of an attitude which is there. And as Karen mentioned about the kind of resettlement site, we realize that even in the size of housing or designs or location of housing, communities have never been consulted. So before that, before getting into the other major challenges, I thought I'll just highlight some of the reasons why, communities are not included in the processes. One, what we've realized that in most of the policy processes or, even in the program design processes, people are not involved. So as Karen was mentioning about one of the policies that came up in 2020, the Affordable Urban Housing and Habitat Policy, not a single community member or a community-based group was consulted in the process. Second, one of the major issues that people in the settlements are facing, especially in the affordable housing project under PMAY, is the beneficiaries contribution. So we've realized that government came up with a government order number 28 in 2020, which was not made available in the public domain. People did not know about it. But however, this GO was very crucial in the AHP project because it determined that the beneficiaries contribution will be 1.5 lakh. And it is very, they are determining this particular amount of payment when most of the houses were either completed or when most of the houses were under different stages of construction. So none of the people were aware that people will have to be paying so much to get hold of their houses. So And when people made a big noise about it, the next big decision regarding resolving this issue comes up in an announcement by the Chief Minister of the state, who says that, okay, if people are not able to pay anything, we will ensure that you are linked to a nearest financial institution, and you'll be able to pay the financial institution. And after you pay back all your loans, you will be able to get the housing documents. So, and all these decisions in terms of, a policy for the people, or determining the amount for beneficiaries' contribution, or how this particular beneficiaries' contribution will be paid, nothing was consulted with the community who are actually the beneficiaries of these schemes. And it became the entire decision was so coercive, because there were people work camps which were provided by the government, or in rental accommodation waiting for these houses. So they had no other choice but to accept these solutions provided by the government. And recently there was an issue in Chennai which brought, it kind of brought housing back into the limelight. Was the issue of KP Park, where these 11-storied housing was provided, and there was an issue in terms of quality. And when this entire issue came up, when communities were also mentioning that in KP Park, people were not, consulted about the number of floors they were provided. See, all these AHP project which government is now constructing are all for reconstruction purposes. So there were already tenements there which were G+3 or G+4 floors. And now government decides that because the land is always vested with the government decides that they will demolish the G+3 or G+4 housing and provide G+8 to G+15. So whether people like it, whether people want it, is not at all a question, because they say this is our land and we will decide what we want to do with the spaces available. And in certain areas, they say, in order to minimize resettlement to houses located in the peripheral areas of the city, we are coming up with such solutions. But whatever it is, the people who are there, who have already paid for these houses and have got a sale deed, or people who have already paid some amount of it may not have got the sale deed, nobody was consulted in this entire process. But you realize that there are certain GOs that have evolved, there are certain announcement that comes in the media which determines the decision for them. And another thing, very crucial thing about community participation is that most of the crucial documents are never available in the public domain. So when I was talking about GO 28, which determined the beneficiaries' contribution, it was not available in the public domain. People had to fight to get, when people from KP Park and other locations in North Chennai were demanding for the documents, that the government said there is a particular GO which has already determined that you'll have to pay so much. So most of the crucial documents are never made available in the public domain at all. So that there is a need for emphasizing on community accountability and transparent housing processes. And another thing that why communities do not have access to information is because most of the crucial documents are not available in the vernacular language, that is Tamil in this case. So we find that right from the Slum Act to the 2020 Affordable Housing Policy to the Social Sustainable Grievance Managed Framework or the Resilience Urban Design Framework, which Tamil Nadu Slum Clearance Board was bought, nothing is available in the vernacular language, which means if people need access to these information, you need someone to actually translate it for them. So recently in the assembly, Tamil Nadu government has also brought up the urban employment scheme for the workers. Now, this urban employment scheme document is completely in English, which is approved by a government order. There was any consultation before actually finalizing this scheme. So what we have felt is, people, because housing is seen as a charity and not as a right, government decides what they want to do with the people, and they kind of force them into accepting these decisions. So our researchers point out that in the last 5 years, over 18,000 families were resettled, forcefully evicted and resettled in the sites located in the peripheral areas of the city. Now, there was absolutely no, consultation at all. Only except for 5 locations, there was no community consultation process. Out of the 64 settlements evicted, only in 5 settlements, there was some sort of community consultation process. In the other areas, people did not even know where they are going to be housed. There was an instance when one of the settlement which was demolished, people were actually preparing to go to another resettlement site called Perumbakam. And only when the after the bulldozers have raised down, they demolished their houses, people got to know that actually they were not going to a site called Budapakam, but they're actually going somewhere else, in Perumbakam. So, and that too, government did not announce them. The people from our team who were there eventually to see how the process is taking place ended up reading the allotment order and explaining to the community. So this is how communities are treated, unfortunately. And what we have also felt, why there is a need for it, is because in most of these eviction processes, people have, complained that, if there were discussions with communities, there would have been better options, available for resettling them, or for proximate resettlement, or even in situ upgradation. In some communities were also mentioning is that the design of the houses are not culturally sensitive. The number of floors or where a kitchen should be, or consulted with communities. And one classic example is in the resettlement site of Perumbakam, which is one of the biggest, which has around 22,000 houses now. There you find that in the old designs of you will find that there is only one tap facility in the entire house, and that is in the bathroom and not in the kitchen. So communities kept on asking, how is it that the government is expecting us to draw water from the bathroom and use it for the kitchen? Would they be doing that if they were constructing a police quarters or a quarters for the government employees? So, people have also got that people are not treated in a dignified manner when they're being evicted or resettled, or when when houses are being provided for them. So this is something that we need to be, emphasizing with government, that there should be better transparency in terms of, putting up all the government orders in the public domain. Secondly, there is also a need to there is also a need to ensure that most of the key documents are made available in the vernacular language. And also, what we have realized is in Chennai, we have seen this as an example where people even consulted. But what we've realized is the power of people can definitely bring about a difference. But because in the city of Madurai, what we've realized is in one particular area called Subramaniapuram, where they were proposed to be resettlement, there was a proposal for resettlement. Most of these people were cleanliness workers or the conservancy workers of the government. What happened was people formed themselves into a collective. They were able to demand that they do not want to be moved out because their employment is all within the city. And they formed a committee. With the committee in place, they were able to negotiate for their in-situ housing. And one of the important things that we learned from that particular process in Madurai is that when people formed a committee and they started proposing it, even the most impossible things seemed to be possible. For example, in this particular area, the land was with the Madurai Corporation, and the Tamil Nadu Slum Clearance Board said in-situ is not possible unless and until the Madurai Corporation gives a NOC. That is a no objection certificate. But the communities were involved in the entire process. They were able to meet even the meet the chief minister of the state. Kind of push their agenda inside and managed to get a no objection certificate from Madurai Corporation. And after the land transfer, there was a committee which was formed. For the first time, we have heard that there was a committee which was formed to monitor the entire housing process, including selection of beneficiaries. The process of selection of beneficiaries was made quite transparent. It was mandated to put up all the list of beneficiaries in the notice board in the area. The people asked, what is our design? How is our houses going to be constructed? We do not want anything more than ground plus 3 process. So we have realized that in one hand, the government was forcefully, pushing their agenda inside. On the other hand, there were cases where with community consolidation and with collective action, there were the entire resettlement was avoided and construction was made possible. And finally, to talk about it, Karen was talking about the mentioning of the affordable housing affordable rental housing complexes that was mentioned. See, once government came up with it, we realized that all of these projects which were sanctioned and under this particular heading was under this particular program was all for workers who were in specific construction areas under big industries. However, immediately after this was announced, we've had several, demand letters from different, welfare associations. For example, the Welfare Association for the Northeast Persons in Tamil Nadu, as well as the other associations started raising comment as to why the people who were there in rental housing in the other parts of the cities were not even considered for this, even if it was on a priority. So we realized that all of these programs are designed top down. There is no consultation with civil society groups, or maybe a limited consultation with civil society groups, but definitely no sort of consultations with the community. And one thing that we have realized is most of these decisions are not based or most of these programs are not planned with data which is available, because there are data available on the number of migrant workers, especially in the post-COVID situation where where the government was arranging for transportation and other facilities for the migrant workers. So despite having at least not the full data, but even some decent amount of data, the government was not able to use it, basically because they want to take up the low-hanging fruit. It was much easier for them to provide housing where there was an organized setup and where the industries particularly were able to lobby for it. We're not saying we don't want that. The idea is that there needs to be a consultative process. There needs to be some sort of discussion before finalizing most of these plans by the government. So one thing that we've been also advocating with the government in our recent negotiations with the government is that any policy, any plans that has to be planned for the communities, any program design, decisions that the government takes up needs to be consulted with community-based group. So this is something that even not just us, but there is formulation of a lot of residents welfare associating that the government will actually at least listen to the voices of the communities. Yeah.
Thank you, Vanessa. I think the point that you brought out about the need for transparency and also the most important aspect of consulting with the group that is that for whom it is being provided is very important. Now we have Vinita Nalla, who is from IHS, who's going to speak about how the market itself is providing for the informal sector workers. Vinita is a senior associate in the practice team at IIHS, Indian Institute of Human Settlements, Bangalore. Her research and practice spans across themes of disaster risk recovery, climate justice, and affordable housing. More recently, she has worked on Recovery with Dignity project, RWD, wherein her research focused on representation of disasters and recovery needs in litigation. She's also a PI on study, principal investigator on a study to understand how low-income rental housing is happening in India. And she teaches in various courses on urban risk and resilience and affordable housing. Welcome, Vinita. Over to you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Anju. So can I share my screen?
Sure. Chinmay?
Yes, you can share your screen now.
Oh, yes, it is allowing me to. Is my screen visible to everybody?
Yes. Yes.
So good afternoon. I'm Vinita, and I primarily work on climate and disaster risk in urban areas with the focus on housing. What I will talk about today are findings from 2 projects conducted in Coimbatore city, focusing on migrant laborers. So As we know, India is fast urbanizing, and rural and urban migration are a significant driver of this urbanization. So poor employment opportunities, access to services prompt migration to urban areas. And now, from a risk perspective, migration is understood as a coping mechanism and prospectively as an adaptive strategy of weighing risks between staying and moving. So this trade-off of weighing of options between staying and moving is what guides their decision to migrate. So I'm just laying down the context for migration and just to get into the rental housing frame, because what we found was that most of the participants of our surveys and our projects in rental housing happen to be migrants. So then we also have to do like a larger study to understand what is the migration scenario in the country. So what we found was that once in urban areas, migrants continue to face multiple challenges, and they tend to pick up precarious and risky jobs, live in unsafe and risk-prone areas, and which are typically poorly serviced and lack political and social recognition. So actually, one of the sites that we do study is what Vanessa just talked about in Perumbakam site. So it was really interesting to have that perspective also. So some studies actually demonstrate that when moving from urban to rural areas, their vulnerability is often replicated and may even be exacerbated. So given this, we also know that migration is not uniform across the country. It is pocketed within certain locations which are rapidly industrializing, which attracts migrants due to more livelihood opportunities. These are also regions that have high incidence of rental housing in urban areas to accommodate the influx of migrant population. Now, while it is expected that migrants would choose to live at a location that is viable, that is close to their work areas, and at a cost that is affordable, the rental housing being provided for this low income bracket is often not adequate in terms of it is marred by poor living conditions, congestion, limited or no access to basic amenities, and it is also primarily provided by private individual landlords, because there is no, I mean, up until now, the ARHC scheme, but until when we did this study in 2019, there were no schemes as such for rental housing or affordable rental housing or low income rental housing that could actually accommodate or in fact, migrants are actually perceived as outsiders and hence cannot avail any social or welfare benefit support from the state. So Coimbatore is one such a city that has been attracting a large number of migrants from across the country. It is in its third phase of industrialization. It was first textile, second was manufacturing, and now Coimbatore is playing host to IT industry in the outskirts of the city, mostly towards the north area. I don't know if you can see my cursor. So it's around this area where the city is expanding and where the IT sector is sort of coming up. And that's where a large number of migrants, especially in the low-income segment, take up service sector jobs like security guards, cleaners, etc. And here the landscape is changing at a very rapid pace, actually, from agriculture to trade and service sectors. And so that's something that really intrigued us. And now, given this context, what we did was we conducted a survey of around 603 migrant laborers in Coimbatore city, and to understand the experiences of migration in the city. So what we found was that our study comprised of migrants from, that of those 603 people, they hailed from 19 different states, largely from Rajasthan, Bihar, AP, and MP, apart from a large chunk of around 24% of the 603 who were from other districts in Tamil Nadu itself. A lot of them belong to 18 to 40% age group, and of course, a majority of them were men. They primarily work as daily wage laborers and construction industrial sectors, and most of them moved after 2010, but there were a significant proportion of them who moved prior to 2005. That means that they have been in this in this city as a migrant for a decade or more. And most prominent reasons for migrating were unsurprisingly low income in native regions and poor employment options. So in the city too, they had limited access or limited to poor access to basic services, often leading to health issues, which was cited as a primary concern in their cities. Now, Filtering down from all of this, what we found was that 81% of them lived in rented accommodations, out of which 62% of them paid rent for a house that had a temporary roof. In the absence of any state or any other formal modes of rental housing provision, landlords are, as I said earlier, are the largest suppliers of rental housing for this income bracket. And apart from the 81%, the rest were all employer provided housing. So because it is unregulated to a large extent, rent as a component of their income also varied depending on which location, what is the kind of housing unit, their own household status and all of it. So rent as a component ranged between 5 to 43%, and 17% of the renters stated that they were paying more than 20% of their household incomes. So this is where our study is located, that is understanding the renting experience of migrants in Coimbatore. Another part of our study was also in Bangalore, but today I'll focus on Coimbatore. So we, the team under actually Swastik and Gautam supervision, focused on low-income rental housing. And I won't go into the details of the methods, but by our calculations, we were looking at households paying 3,600 rupees or less rent per month in the city. And we conducted detailed qualitative surveys and mesh drawings to understand the spatial and social aspects of their residence in the city. So I'll take you through 3 case studies that best highlight their case, and all names have been anonymized, whatever you will see after this. So Narayan Families Built to Rent. So this was one of the first cases that we had come across in the outskirts of, the northern area of Chennai, of Coimbatore that I was speaking about earlier, where an IT zone had come up, and a lot of agrarian households were contemplating converting or providing houses or units for rent to people who would come there. So one such a case was Narayan Families, and they had a large grove of farmland, which is a coconut grove, and they were growing. They had multiple, crops that they were using there, and So what they did was that in 2013, they had the orange is the owner's house, and the owner, the landlord, Narayan, he was the operations head at this IT sector. So he was familiar with all the security guards and all of them over there, and they had come to him and said, you have this land, it's close by. Can we just stay there, and do you think you'd be able to provide us accommodation? So then they built a series of row units, and with a series of bathrooms that each of these row units would access, and for a monthly rent of 2,500 per room, that is shared between 5 to 6 men. Mostly all of them are from the same community. Like when we visited in 2019, they were all from Assam. And so in 2019, actually, when we visited, they had added 5 more blocks, because the demand for rental housing had increased so much, because there were more number of people coming there for service sector sort of jobs, where there were security guards, there were like domestic help in those areas. So then they increased that area, and the layout of the unit was quite typical. And I would emphasize on this layout, because this is something that we found recurred across different case studies with slight permutation and combination. So it typically consists of one room with an attached with a kitchenette sort of a thing, or a counter, and the toilets are either attached with the room or are provided separately. In this case, each unit had their own toilet facility that they could use, and so the inside of the room looks something like this. And there was a courtyard, and these are the washrooms that they could access. So we found variations of this sort of arrangement in different case studies. For example, in Tirumeni's Built to Rent, which was another case very close to Narayan Family's house. But here the agenda was a little different, because initially in 2014, Tirumeni with his son and their new daughter-in-law, they lived in a fairly big house on their big agricultural land. And then as a retirement plan, he saw that there was an IT sector coming up, and that there would be a demand for rental housing, and they had land here. So he built a 3-story house, a 3-story building, which was supposed to cater for nuclear families or couples who would be at mid-level to senior levels, mid-level to low-level sort of employees at the IT firm. So he built the he built the house thinking of attracting families to stay in that area. And then over time they moved out from their son's house and they had their own house. And then he realized that the people he wasn't able to attract the kind of target audience that he had built the rental unit for, and instead the demand that came was from, again, low income segment group, which comprised of security guards primarily. And then he was like, okay, I can repurpose this house and give it out to rent for this. So then he sort of gave this entire building, and then there was more demand, so then he built a row housing. And then in 2019, when we went and visited him, he was building rental units over his own house. But because he wanted to maintain privacy, he sort of connected these two buildings so that the tenants could access from their own tenement and not disturb him. And the interesting thing about this is that if you look at the plan, the row housing that he built is again the same as the one we saw in the previous case study, where if they are single bachelors, once he realized that there are no families coming here, for single bachelors, he assumed that this is an adequate sort of an arrangement that would be adequate for them. And so it again comprises of one room that is shared between 5 to 6 workmen, and with an attached bathroom, and a small room or a counter for a kitchenette. So previously what he had built was a living room, a bedroom, a kitchen, and then he realized that this is not the audience that he's getting. So when he expanded his house, he built again just 2 units sort of a thing without any, it's sort of a variation of this rather than a full 1 BHK house unit. It's again like one room with an attached washroom, then you go in, you have another room with an attached bathroom. So each unit is shared by 8 to 10 single workmen, and there are 4 such units here. So then he was able to get enough income by building as many units as he could, because he realized that this was a good income opportunity for him. So this is what the house actually looks like. So this is what he built first, and then this is what he was building later. And this whole line of shoes here are their security, the security guards who were renting out this place, and this is where they sort of bridge so that the landlord also had privacy. So it's like studying the built form also gave us a lot of insights into the kind of social relationships that landlords wanted to have with their tenants. And again, this is built form that is emerging organically without any sort of planning, based on need, based on the financial status of the landlord at different times of his life, 2014, then 2018, then 2020, at which time he was able to put in. And he continued to invest back into his rental property because he realized that this is a place where he can actually make a decent income. The last one, of course, is Ramaswamy's land rental. So it's again agrarian land, and he was approached by contractors of construction industries happening nearby, again, who were who were providing construction labor either for inner city projects or for building the IT sector. Building requirements and all of that. So there were a lot of labor that needed to be housed, and what Ramaswamy did was that here is my agricultural land which I am happy to give out for rent. And what the contractors did was that they said that we will continue to provide you tenants, and you let them build their own house there. So this was self-built housing, where they paid rent, a monthly rent about 500. Again, Ramaswamy said it was 250, but then the tenants that we spoke to said it was 500. Suddenly, we just declared both of those. So they paid rent for both of these, and for just building their own house. So they were paying basically rent for land, and there was no access to any sort of amenities as such. There weren't bathrooms, there weren't a water supply or a drain supply. So they were able to source it from nearby areas, and the houses themselves they built by sourcing building materials from the construction sites that they were working at. In the previous two cases, the landlords were able to provide, you know, they were able to provide electricity, water supply, drain, and all of it, albeit a little bit more constricted. Like in the previous case study, Tirumeni actually had the hand pump at the ground floor, so that they would have to, if they wanted a larger quantity of water, they would have to fill it up and take it upstairs, just so that he thought it was a way of controlling, you know, so that they don't use or waste a lot of water. So there are a lot of these small design elements that we were beginning to observe that had a lot to do with the kind of relationships or the kind of perception that the landlords had with their tenants. And then
Nita, can you wrap up?
yeah, sorry, I'm done actually. So to conclude, I would just like to reiterate that, you know, in the city, migrants are well outside the purview of the state, and they rent privately and have no social benefits, welfare schemes, or safety nets to avail, despite them having living in the city for over a decade. And as I said before, private individual landlords are the largest suppliers of rental housing, and rent is more or less market driven. It was rare to see any rental agreements in this segment. In some cases, an agreement was only drawn up if the tenant asked for it, which was again rare. From the point of view of landlords who are often dependent on rental income, this form of renting seems to be giving a fairly good returns, and enabling them to further invest in rental housing. So in our studies, we emphasize the need to recognize individual landlords as rental housing providers and try to look at ways that state could actually extend social benefits to migrants. So I'll stop here because I know Swastik can add a lot more to this. Thank you.
All right. Really sorry for asking you to wrap up.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I think it's important to note that, you know, the market actually provides a lot of options, and that is why they're able to kind of survive in the city to start with, and, you know, kind of access livelihood opportunities. But like you said in your concluding remarks, the state has to take responsibility. The state has to find a way to kind of plan things better, and, you know, get a good create a dignified space for people, you know, to live and to grow. So on that note, I'll move on to our next speaker. I would like to invite Swastik Harish. He's an urban development professional, urban development and capacity building expert with 20 years of experience, and is the director of his own company. He previously worked with Indian Institute of Human Settlements, IIHS, where he led the Urban Practitioners Program, UPP, the capacity building and training function, and the design lab, which focuses on architecture and urban spatial design, and co-led the housing research and practice team. His research, practice, and teaching portfolio include land and housing for the urban poor, with focus on rental housing and housing policy, and design and development sector, and pedagogy for practitioners. So Swastik is here to speak on the case of Mysore city and the scheme that they have there called Mane. Welcome, Swastik, and over to you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anju. Thank you so much. Thanks, Vinita. Great presentation. You know, the fact that the market can actually do a lot is true, but we must also be aware that the nature of the market itself has changed now. And I'll sort of hark back to what Karen said some time back, that, you know, people-driven sort of a market, which is basically people catering to themselves for their own housing or for providing rental and so on and so forth. That is largely how housing is developed and how it works in this country. There's no doubt about it. But the definition of this market is increasingly changing now, and that is something that all of us on this group should be aware and a little cautious about. That the market is now becoming about big capital, and that is something to be seen. Now, when I say big capital, I mean things like the ARHC, for example, the Affordable Rental Housing Scheme, scheme. So here, what the state is doing is it's almost stepping back in some way from the role as even a facilitator. They're basically just saying, we have a scheme, you can please put in the money and do everything. So in a sense, what they're saying is that they're leaving it very often to and especially the current regime is basically very big market oriented and not small market oriented. And that's a distinction we should maintain, because the big market of course has more money and investment, but at the same time it has its very strong let's say demands on investment returns and so on and so forth. So just want to make that distinction. I think it's a point that we need to keep in mind. I have very little to say, because Karen has actually almost covered everything that I wanted to talk about. So but I don't know if you can see my screen. I'll just show you I'll get into a little detail about what this sites and services kind of thing could look like, which is basically something like a bit of a study that we did in Mysore. This project was by and of itself not called Mane. Mane means house in Kannada. It was not called Mane, but Hudco made a publication of it, and that publication itself was called Mane. So it was a co-funded project between the City Improvement Trust Board of Mysore, which is basically the Urban Development Authority from that time. And in the 80s, it was called the CITB. Many cities had a CITB, and Hudco, which provided a long-term loan basically to actually implement this project. And I'll come back to this idea of loan and finance structuring towards the end, basically. But what I wanted to show was actually a little bit of detail as to 2-3 things that came out from our study, which was the same thing that, for example, what Karen said, that this was really, this kind of public housing was sites and services based, but in this case it was a one let's say intervention above sites and services. So what we call it is a site, shell and services. So there's basically a site given, there's also a small building unit given, which is just a hall and a toilet or something like that, and then there are services attached to it, which include some road and drainage and so on and so forth. So it's a site, shell and services kind of a scheme, and it was implemented in several parts of Mysore. Which would very well have been peri-urban at that time in the 80s and 90s. But having said that, I'll try and show you how it has changed and what the outcomes are. I'll try and get into that detail towards the end of this small PPT, basically. So the City Improvement Trust Board and Hudco made this project, and basically I wanted to talk about first about what this house itself looked like, because eventually lived experience is happening at the house level. Families, people are all basically living over there. So what does this so-called unit look like? And here are some examples from that time, and these are I'm going to reiterate this again and again, that the main thing, I think one of the most biggest value adds that the government was able to bring into this project at that point of time was that they hired leading architects, actually not just leading and some young architects at that time who were young architects, to actually work on these projects and to come up with designs and ideas on the housing, on the layouts, on the neighborhoods, and how to make that integration take place. So a lot of these were composite schemes, like Karen said. So there was a cross subsidy model and so on and so forth. But a lot of the houses, the majority of the houses were basically either EWS or LIG. And here what you're seeing is a ground floor plan of an EWS house. I mean, there are many projects. So I'm just showing you one example from one project. And the basic layout over here is very simple. If you notice that on the left hand side, the EWS house basically just has one hall, a toilet, bathroom kind of a complex, but it has land at the front and the back. And it also has what I would call basically a little bit of working space, which is sort of in and out of the house at the same time. So it's not exactly inside the house, it's not exactly outside the house. So what I've shown over here in purple, and on the right hand side, the LIG one had a open space within the house. So it had a courtyard basically inside the house. So in a sense, while we can say that, oh, how can we have the luxury of so much land, etc., this land that is left out for future work, expansion, use in different ways, has actually the greatest value in the future. So if I was to stop valuing land purely from an economic extractive purposes as of today, but see what land use may be, or the value of a particular land use may be in the future, then this kind of thinking can actually be opened up. And so these are the kinds of units that they were basically making, saying that, we don't know everything about what the people would want. And so here are some places where you will get your basic services in place, you'll get shelter, and then there's something that you can build upon. Now, of course, this is World Bank, MUDP, those kinds of projects that were driving this agenda, and it was trying to also reduce the overall cost structure of the government, so for the government. So it was basically saying that instead of making full-fledged houses and so on and so forth, why not allow people to invest in their own houses and sort of let them build it up in that sense. So that kind of philosophy was kind of trying to be tried out over here. And this, what looks like a fairly complicated kind of a diagram, is actually an EWS house, ground floor EWS houses, in a nicely tightly packed configuration. What you're seeing on the right hand side is basically the how the individual house unit is. It's just got that one hall which is called dining/living in this plan, a little partition to a sleeping area and a cooking area, not so-called a kitchen, and behind an open yard and a toilet area basically. So now what this gives us is 2-3 things. One is basically that the definition of house components among different people is usually quite different. So I may be familiar with something called so-called a bedroom or so-called a kitchen, but a lot of people are absolutely do not make such distinction. I have seen in many cases, for example, the kitchen is where the stove is, and the stove is not necessarily a gas stove. The stove could be a kerosene stove, which is the main thing used to make the big patila of rice or whatever it may be. Now that goes into the backyard or it goes into the front yard, that becomes the kitchen for the day. So the kitchen is not necessarily a fixed space in many small houses particularly. Same for sleeping areas. I don't think, I mean, if there are 4 or 5 people, there's one place which may be a little bit more private, but the entire house is in a sense a living and a sleeping area, because people will spread out all over the place. So what this means is that some kind of flexibility starts coming into the use. People can start using it on their own, and they get an open yard, which is, I think, in my opinion, the biggest value add that this project brought, that each house got a little bit of a open area, not much, 5-10 square meters, not even that much actually, and a little outside space which I've colored here in purple, which starts becoming not just an interactive space, but also not just an interactive space, but also space for a little bit of commercial activity and to sort of exploit for your work and so on and so forth. And so the left hand side is just a repetition of the same thing. And here you're seeing basically how community spaces, and now I put a new color, which is red colored over here, which are open spaces which are at a community level. So there are purple colored little, spill out spaces where you can carry out your work, or you can socially interact and things like that between 1 or 2 or 3 houses. But the entire set of about 4 or 5 houses would have a bigger community space as well. So this kind of design approach, and for all the skeptics over here, we were also very skeptical, saying that this takes too much land, etc. But we were able to adequately prove that at least up to a G+3 or a G+4 structure, and this kind of an arrangement actually takes up the same amount of land area. Because there's a limit to the density that you can do, and we cannot, if you start violating the density, then basically we're talking about a lack of quality of life, and that's where issues start coming in. Whether I do it in ground floor or whether I do it in G+3, or G+10, but as long as basic services and a certain level of density which that basic service can support is not matched, the problems start emerging at that point of time. So I'm talking about it from a physical infrastructure and planning and design point of view, but this is one of the fundamental sort of takeaways from this project over here. And moving on to what the architects at that time had planned, and here is you can see the labels over here. These are basically phasing plans for each house, and so you can see the size, the width of this house is about 12 feet, just that much. It's just 12 feet, but it's about 40 feet long, so it's a long thin plot. And on that there is a lot of activity on the ground floor. The first floor gets built up over phases, and so people can add something at the back, they can add something on the top, they can add something in the front, and so on and so forth. And I'll show you some examples of how this actually worked out after almost 20-30 years of this implementation. And this is another example of how flexibility can be attached to basically even a low cost house for a low income family, because a family is not going to remain, hopefully not, and this is the case, I would say, or it's very much the case that one can look for, is that the family is not going to remain low income throughout their lives. I mean, they will grow and develop and become economically more stronger, as well as socially more embedded and integrated into the system. So this kind of a thing has to be supported, and so this kind of flexibility in the living spaces was sort of allowing for that. And this is a very clear articulation from the the same publication that said basically this is how the units will actually grow. So you can see that there is a growth process thought out, and I'm not saying that this is the right one or something like that. All I'm saying is that this thinking went in at that point of time, and people were able to say that, okay, people will start with this much. The authorities, the government, HUDCO itself was able to get these architects and get them to think this way, that you know, people will start with something and then grow to the next step and then grow on to the next step and so on and so forth. So this in a sense is a bit of a, you know, climbing up a ladder in terms of your house value and so on and so forth, that people will always do. So when we take this to the idea of the cluster, or, you know, groups of houses at the neighborhood and so on and so forth, this is what it starts looking like. So you start having like lots of green space, open spaces, community spaces. So basically your land use, or rather I would say the value associated with the land starts becoming richer. So it's richer when I say is that you may say that, oh, economically this is a waste of space or whatever it is, but socially and environmentally, which is of course a critical thing these days, both from a social and environmental use point of view, this is the highest value of land that you can possibly get out of it. So this is the kind of what you know, the kind of clusters that emerge from this kind of planning and thinking. And this is what the overall layout of one of the layouts, one of the projects at that time, this Kuvempu Nagar, it's in south west of Mysore, and really it was peripheral at that time, and these are the kinds of large level public spaces that were part of it. So what you're seeing, that square over there on the top right, is basically a green space around which all the EWS plots are there. So those are those small plots of 12 feet by 40 feet. Those are the plots basically. And you can see that as you go towards the main road, the plots start getting a little bigger, and that was the cross subsidy model of having MIG and HIG plots and so on and so forth. But a majority of these are on the EWS and LIG side. So and the reds are basically, the red colors is plot for a school which come up in the future. The greens are parks and public spaces in that sense, and the purples are actually meant for work. So it's called city center, or it's called basically land bank. It's really a commercial or an economic value of a land that people were looking for in the future while designing this. And so let me show you what this looks like. So this is the same plan that I just showed you, and this is what it looked like in 2003. Right, so it basically had been built. So you can see all these ground floor structures, and you can see it's basically the development is basically coming towards the south and the west. It's sort of just finishing. There's nothing much more happening after that, but it's not like it's outside the city. It's still at the edge of the city essentially. This is the kind of plan that was made. Then in 2013, much of the area around it has built up, and you'll start noticing that some of the land that was left over for those commercial or for economic value basically have started being built up and started being used in you know, it's a matter of about 15 years that it has taken to do that. And here is what it looks like in you know, currently in 2021, where it's basically well integrated into the city fabric. It's basically, in fact, it looks much better than much of the city fabric around it. And you can see over here, I don't know if my mouse will show up, but like on the left, you know, just left and south of the square that you saw, there is the commercial buildings that have started coming up over here. So which that land bank that was left over there. So this kind of growth takes place over a generation and a half, and this is something that we should be aware of. So peri-urban areas or peripheral areas or fringe areas are not necessarily all bad, as long as some kind of a economic ladder, economic ecosystem can be thought of for how to integrate that eventually into the city. Now, some places it may fail, but this is probably one of the ways to think about even in the future when our small cities are going to grow and so on and so forth. So it's not maybe necessarily true of Bangalore. It may also be, but so many small cities which will definitely grow towards the periphery. This may be one way to think about it. So we look at it in a bit of a close up just to sort of close this argument about what it looks like. And this is 2010, so it's not very long ago, about 10-11 years ago, and it's still, you can see, it's largely all ground floor and just single floor kind of buildings over here. And now you start noticing the first floors, and the one or two few buildings have started generating a first floor and have started basically expanding front and back. And the fabric has moved from being quite regular to being a little irregular, but not too irregular. We just went here some few years back, and there is still no question of encroachment or anything like that. And this is what it looks like today, where basically everything has, literally each and every house has a first floor, and there are cars on the street, and basically people have and this is not because of, I'll reiterate this, this is not gentrification, this is not buying out or consolidation of properties that is taking place at all. We have been here, and it's the same. I would say about 70 to 80% sounded like they are the same inhabitants that got the plot maybe about 25-30 years back, and they've basically grown and added floors to their houses and sort of grown in this way. So while there will obviously be some buyouts and consolidation, it doesn't seem to be the majority of the case, especially because the plots are so small. I don't think rich investors would be too interested in actually trying to purchase those. So this is what the link of that film. It's on YouTube. And just to close this kind of presentation of mine, you can see the kind of spaces that are coming up. They're friendly, they're like women friendly. The women were very particular that women can stay here alone also. It's perfectly safe. You can call out to anybody, children run around. It's like really a neighborhood, that kind of a thing, which to me eventually is really the outcome you're looking for, a safe, inclusive place to stay. And that's something that was which is not stopping your opportunity. So people are making their shops and doing their business and so on and so forth, and looking for jobs because they have the background, or the context has changed essentially. And yeah, here's some activities, and you can see the insides of the houses over here. Somebody made a shop. This lady on the top right has basically taken a loan to open a tailoring shop, and she and her husband are tailors. They're doing very well now. And on the left hand side bottom, the lady basically bought the next house and expanded into that. Now she has a 3 BHK. So so people are obviously going to have aspiration, grow according to that. And the bottom right it's a dosa batter, basically a grinding stone which has been built into the floor inside the kitchen, and this is not something that you'll be able to do in a flat at all, basically without reaching a neighbor below you. And yeah, so just to sort of close with my basic takeaways that I really wanted to speak about using this example was there has to be a big emphasis on the social use of land. We have to get back to that argument strongly. And it is interesting that this so-called affordable housing zone, which is there, let's say in the Karnataka affordable housing policy, and now it is a mandate in the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, affordable housing zones have to be made in master plans. And that is the place where we have to find the social use of land, the environmental use of land, and push the government towards coming up with guidelines, principles on how to make affordable housing zones, and actually making them, demarcating them on master plans. That's the only way to control this abnormal and economic value, the abnormal emphasis on economic value of land that these days we see in our cities, which we have been seeing for some time. The second thing is about financing. This was basically, I put it down in my head as a housing ladder. So we're looking at a generation worth of input that has to go in order to build that housing capital, essentially. So here HUDCO came in and with a long-term loan, and that's really an important piece over here. But they were able to control costs because of the way the land was organized, and because the cost itself was kept low, because they were not making apartments, they were just making one room, and so they were able to keep the cost low, and so therefore it became affordable, but yet was given out on a lease come sale basis, which means it's essentially a rent to own kind of a thing. So you can only own it after about 10-15 years. And I think that's what I see, that after the ownership became clear, to have people really invested and gone into building their first floor, second floor, and so on and so forth. So that's the second point I want to make. And finally, we have to professionalize design. Right now, we cannot afford design to be outsourced, I can give you a quick example. I was working closely with Karnataka Housing Board, and I asked them, who does all your design for your apartment complexes? And they said there's an architect. I was like, who is this architect? Because I think there are problems in this, or it can be much better. And they said it's the same architect who gets the projects every time. And I was like, okay, so that's how it works, basically. So we have to professionalize this entire procurement process of design, and get, one of the strong suggestions we made is how to get students involved, how to get internships on this kind of a question, and sort of start converging between this sarkari procurement rigid system, which is obviously always also cheated upon, but at the same time, how can we so it's not really like it's working very well. So how do we actually include other stakeholders in design, including how Vanessa said about community, and including, I feel, professional people in professional streams such as students and all. So I'll stop here, and I hope that has given us some ideas for the purpose of this webinar.
Thank you so much, Swastik. I think that was really rich. I think we saw some very examples. And the most important point that came out is the question of land, how you treat it, and the whole aspect of social and environmental value. Nobody really talks about that. It's always the economic value. And the irony is that in India, I mean, the informal sector is so much integrated in the formal that, not giving them enough space is really not fair. And pushing them to the periphery is just not fair. And, pushing the agenda of social inclusion is very important. And that was, and another interesting point was the question of professionalizing design. That design innovations that we saw today, and today in your cases, as well as yesterday in the Kerala case, some beautiful buildings with beautiful solutions and beautiful architecture. The Kerala case was really beautiful. I mean, it didn't feel like a EWS housing at all. So design makes or breaks it, creates a certain quality of spaces. And so thank you for bringing that to light. Now I would like to invite Mr. Rajendran Prabhakar, who's the executive of Marga. He works in the field of in the field of urban deprived communities for the last 3 decades at South India level. He is the part of state level networks on slum people's rights organization, involved in land and housing rights movement, led by he led many people's movement and struggles against evictions and land grab. And presently, Marga is working with 24 slums in Bangalore. They work with children, youth, women on education and skill building. So Mr. Rajendran Prabhakar, he's here to speak about the experiences of his organization, and welcome, and over to you. Thank you. Is he here? Mr. Prabhakar?
He's not here, I guess.
Oh dear. He was here in the beginning. Shall I call him?
Yeah, I think so. Guess he's dropped out or something like that.
Let me just call him.
Can you call the next speaker first?
All right. So meanwhile, I would like to invite Akbar. Akbar A. He is he identifies himself as a designer and an urban practitioner with a specific passion for space design and as a means of social change and ecological empowerment. His learning has been holistic and socially engaged. His education at Drishya Kalika Kendra and at the Srishti Institute of Design, Art, Design and Technology utilized a project-based curriculum with a focus on understanding of place and community. Having worked with Mystery Architects for 2 years, along with being engaged with Place Arts Youth Collective, that puts the methods of art, design, and technology in the hands of youth to empower them with tools to affect and create change in their communities. He's recently completed the Urban Fellows program at IIHS and is currently working with Hasiru Dalla, which is a social impact organization that works with waste pickers and other waste workers to ensure a life of dignity. So thank you, Akbar, for being here. Akbar is going to share his experiences and also partly share the interventions of Awas and how it's impacted his life. Thank you, Akbar. Over to you.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. So hi everyone. My name is Akbar. I born and brought up in one of the urban poor community in Bangalore, which is known as Bible. Just to give a brief, like how my community came into existence. Like my parents kind of migrated from Maharashtra, and they kind of working in Bangalore. So when the slum clearance drive was happening in Bangalore, this particular plot, which is known as Baipanalli, kind of allotted to these migrants. So most of the migrants from Maharashtra and largely from Tamil Nadu. So this particular land kind of designed for 350 people, the land size of 20 by 30. But looking at the numbers of family and the people, the government decided to divide this land into two and make these land make it as a two houses. So in the end, like 700 families kind of accommodated in the community where the 350 community kind of was designed for it. So it was like this happened like 30, 35 years, 40 years back. So that point of time, government just allotted land. There was nothing, no basic infrastructure in terms of sanitation, water, electricity, nothing. So that point of time, Awas came into picture. Awas mainly worked in community building to do different community interventions. They just not worked with in the housing. They also worked in different sector. It could be health sector, it could be education, it could be skill development. So how do you manage your livelihood? So over the year, like when my grandparents, the entire community kind of shifted to this particular community, they kind of really struggled to have basic amenities. It could be drinking water. People used to walk miles to get drinking water, and people used to do open defecation because my community is located in a such a way. There is all these neighbor surrounding land belongs to military and railway. So all these people go open defecation. So over the year, I was kind of focused on doing different community intervention. Housing was a big part, like providing 700 housing is not a easy task. So first they kind of focused on small interventions, like they built a community toilet for the community, then they kind of come with these ideas to, they kind of did 2 bores and we had street taps. Today also the entire community is dependent on street taps for water. And there was one plot which we kind of identify and that kind of acted as a community center where people can come and interact, and there were workshops for people to educate how to fight for your land rights, and there were skill development activities which were happening, and there was different art and design mediums which are used to educate people about education, health, and other awareness programs which kind of happened. So this was the history, and right now this community is kind of developed, like Swastik said, like housing ladder. So my community also kind of went through that. So people from nothing, from just a piece of land, now almost like 50% of houses has like G+1, G+2 structures. So this is the journey my community kind of went through, and I want to talk about like how housing on other community building kind of changes people's aspiration, and how it changed my family's aspiration, my personal aspiration. So once, like when in the initial stage, people just want their aspirations was just to make the livelihood for few weeks. So that's that point of time, like our aspiration was just to survive. Right now, people want to have a better education. They want to go to a good jobs, and they want to improve their life quality of life. Like if you see my community, like most of the people are like right now very focused on having access to a good education. So people, instead of spending on housing and other stuff, people start spending on education. They start sending their children to have better education, and all these people kind of after finishing their graduation and education, they kind of go into better jobs. And right now, most of the people kind of start migrating out. So these spaces kind of becoming small for them, and they kind of their quality of life is kind of improving through these interventions. So my community, like most of the people started migrating out, and a lot of other migrants started living in. So this is kind of transition which is kind of happening. Like my community is kind of going over the years. And while I finished my schooling and I chose to do design education. So at that point of time, we kind of formed a collective, which we wanted to use art and design tools to activate public spaces in different slums, which ours kind of worked on it. So right now, so we kind of took up few parks and few of the public spaces to do public interventions with the community, like public participatory design. We kind of engage community, like we ask them what they want and how can we transform spaces and how can we make these spaces inclusive. So again, we kind of faced lots of challenges that went successfully for a while, and this kind of then it went on a drain because ownership, like people didn't start taking ownership, even though it was public. There was community participation was involved, and it was a long process. So this is the kind of journey we kind of traveled, and yeah, this is what my community is. Yeah.
Thank you, Akbar. Thank you for that first-hand experience that you have shared with us. I'm still trying to get Mr. Prabhakar to join. He is having internet issues. He's trying to join. Meanwhile, if there are any questions, maybe we can take questions for the panelists. Any questions, any clarifications? Laboni is asking, what is the status of these initiatives? For Akbar. Akbar, the question is for you. I think Laboni is talking about the public space initiative. So if you can tell what is the status of the initiative now?
So basically what happened, first of all, I would like to tell why this intervention we wanted to. So if you see all these slums and everything, so there is no defined public spaces. So there is lack of park, there is lack of place. Like for us, public spaces just are streets and other neighborhood areas. If you want to recreate, if you want to go for recreation also, we kind of look for wealthier neighborhood, a richer neighborhood for our recreation. It could be a restaurant, it could be a mall. So we kind of look at space as a recreational space. So over the year, there was a one small patch where people used to dump their garbage. Then BBMP kind of, BBMP is a local municipal corporation. They kind of came into picture, and they kind of, without understanding what community needs, they just built a park and they put a fence. So within 2 months, the entire brand new park is kind of demolished because people didn't take ownership of it. So Place Arts, like I was part of Place Arts, we came into picture that right now some external body came into picture and they kind of designed what they wanted to do without consulting the local people and understanding their need. And this is what the design process we kind of led, where we went to the community and we did series of interactions with the community. It could be women by how can we make this place inclusive to everyone, just not only to the children. How can this particular park, which is like only one open space in the community, which is kind of, we wanted to make it more inclusive to all the people, like it could be elderly, it could be women. So how can these people, and what are the interventions we can do where these people can come and have it? If the space is not designed for me, I won't bother to come there. So this is the process we kind of followed, and we did successfully. We kind of did a couple of murals. There were seating facilities, and we kind of wanted to collect try and wet waste of the community, and we kind of wanted to do the composting within the park and use that same compost to the plant and plant. You put a plant in such a way which gives something back to the community. It could be vegetables, it could be fruits. So like community is kind of investing into it and they're kind of taking it back. So we faced a challenge like people taking ownership. So that was that kind of went on for a while, but it was not sustaining. So we were still figuring out where we went wrong, and co-designing is a big task. So yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Akbar. Interesting. I just would like to now invite any speakers if they want to respond to other presentations that have happened today, share any comments, any views, or anybody else from the participants also you're free to share your thoughts, views, questions, anything. Nobody? Nobody has any questions, any thoughts and views? Then
There is a
sorry,
question.
there's a question. Yeah. What kind of community participation are we arguing for when we talk about affordable housing, considering the varying aspirations within the community?
I think this is to all the speakers.
This is to all the speakers. Yeah. Rajat has asked this question. I think maybe Vanessa can respond to this.
And Karen also.
Or Karen. Is Vanessa there? Yeah.
And there, just give it
Yeah,
2
yeah.
minutes. I'm just stuck in something. Just a second. See, from my experience of working with the communities, yes, of course, people have different aspirations, but the basic minimum of what kind of housing that they're entitled to, and the basic design of the housing, and the amount, the payment that they have to make, at least the basic minimums needs to be consulted with communities. See, finally, it's not any of us who's going to be paying for our houses or any of us who's going to be residing. See, it's something as simple as, when government is selecting, I'll give you a classic example of what happened in Chennai. When Tamil Nadu, Housing Board constructed certain, houses in a particular area where Karen was mentioning, it was very closer to the Ennore thermal power plant. The LIG and MIG groups opposed this, and hence, what happened was they gave up that scheme for the other income group. However, the only scheme which Housing Board currently is constructing for the EWS section is on that in the place near the Ennore thermal power plant, because they know that they can force the decisions on the communities. See, that's the problem, whatever others don't want, they'll give. So they will force it on the communities, because here they feel the communities don't have an option. You can always coerce them. You either take this house or you don't get any houses at all. That's the kind of a thing. So from that perspective, we are saying people needs to be consulted. See, something like this, you and I, if we need to, shift our house to another location, we make plans for such a long time, right? I mean, that's the same for the communities, right? So if we do random evictions during the middle of the academic year, during the monsoons, nobody, and even on days, even on festival days, there has been evictions. So I think all that process needs to stop, and how it will stop is only when people's voices are heard. I mean, from that perspective, we wanted to kind of talk about community consultation, at least in project wises, it has to happen. Yeah, Karen can add on to this.
No, I think I was going to say, no, I totally agree with you, Vanessa, but I think what struck me about the whole set of presentations today from, in fact, all of them, was about how dynamic the urban, neighborhood is. I mean, all the way from, if you think about what Vinita was telling us about the way these agrarian lands become rental, tracts, to what Swastik showed us about this transformation of an area over time, to what Akbar was just telling us about different, sets of people who come and go and their aspirations that change. And I think it's a given that in an urban area, things keep shifting. People come in, they settle, they leave, their aspirations change, etc. And I think, first of all, I think we have to agree that the urban is a very dynamic setting. And, one of the things that Akbar was talking about, which is taking ownership, I think even that changes. I mean, who takes ownership of a particular space, even whether it's a community hall or whatever, over a period of time will change. So for example, now we see in a lot of the resettlement colonies, some of the dynamic and positive things that are happening are, for instance, in perhaps, it's really interesting that in Kanagi Nagar, it is an area that was built, I mean, a sort of initiatives that were built by the police to improve education for children in that area. So, I mean, as I think Akbar was pointing out, is that education has now become a very, very common, I would say, anchoring aspiration for large numbers of people. So if something happens around the field of children's futures, of education, of playgrounds, of evening classes, of tuitions, of things like that, then that anchor, I think, brings a lot of things together, and from it, many other kinds of participation of different stakeholders, whether they're parents, teachers, youth, or state functionaries, can actually take place. So I was just thinking that if we can find anchors in the urban, because the urban is the place for people to live out their dreams of the future, right? They are about aspirations, as the question was asking. Then I think we need to look at where do these futures get built. One is in education, in children, and in youth. And therefore, I mean, this to me seems like a way in which, or a site in which participation can be built. Because it's not always that people want to come out and just talk about housing, or even just about water or whatever, but there's definitely a lot of action that takes place around children, education, etc. So that's kind of some of the thoughts that I just had on this. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have some comments in the chat box, kind of seconding all that you've said, saying that the needs of the children is most important, and it's the most neglected question as far as urban goes. And also, centering everything around education is also another good idea that we can kind of go forward with. So I just want to ask one more time if there are any other questions. Anji Reddy, I thought I saw your hand up. So do you have any questions?
No, Anju, actually by mistake it got connected actually.
Oh, okay. All right. Anybody else, any questions?
I have a thought actually. Because when we talk about, I mean, it's sad that we missed Prabhakaran sir's presentation, because he represents the community and he would have, been here means a lot. One thing that we have to understand is also something which I've missed out is, housing or any of the other housing should not be seen in silos. Secondly, it should be a path for social mobility for communities, at least the most vulnerable groups. That's something that one needs to talk about. It's not like, providing an infrastructure and completely forgetting the people. That's exactly the mindset which government has. And third, why we need to have people's representation is just even, imagine in consultations like these, how many communities get to participate, I think that should be, I know the agenda of these kind of meetings are completely different, but I think somewhere along the line, I cannot actually voice out, I am still an outsider. I am not a person who's from the economically weaker section. I think that needs to be focused, because if we as civil society don't push that, the government is not going to listen to any of us, right? Because they won't feel the need for even going and talking to communities, because this entire idea of charity needs to be done. And I think it's time that, we all stop, we should ensure that whatever demands that we propose should also come from the communities themselves. So that is a way of, real empowerment. It's not like we make policy decisions for the people whom we work for. So that I really wanted to, I think it's a sad thing that if Prabhakaran sir would have been here, it would have enriched our conversation further on the entire involvement of community. Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. He's just feeling terrible about the fact that he's not able to.
Could I just come in here? I
Sure.
just want to clarify something. So I don't know whether the speakers know what we are doing here, but the idea, I mean, this is being organized by communities, actually in the sense of organizations which are working with communities. So it's not this, it's the other way, meaning in the sense they may not be here, but the idea is to put together what many of the experts are saying so that we can take it for a discussion in the organizations with which we work. So Working People's Charter consists of about exact figure, I don't know, 175 organizations, and including individuals working with labor, there are 200. But these are organizations working with different constituencies. So this is being organized in order to get a better idea of what are the different kinds of models, what are the different kinds of policies, which we can then discuss within the communities. So all the discussions and all the presentations here, which are going to be put together, because we are doing North Zone, South Zone, and West. We have done now. East is still to be done. So the idea is to put all this together to take it back. Now it's what will come. So we'd like to continue this conversation with that as part of that discourse. So I just wanted to clarify that in relation to what Vanessa just said. So for us, definitely one community person speaking will not be enough. There has to be 200 communities now relating to this and then getting back on these discussions here.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to kind of bring that in towards the end, but I'm glad Meena brought it up right now. So any final questions? Shall we conclude? Questions or comments? Marina, Brother Varghese, anybody? Okay.
Anju, I have a final request for all speakers to turn on their cameras so that we can take a screenshot of everyone.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, I forgot.
Thank you. So then I'll just conclude, just kind of going over all that we've heard today. We've heard from Karen how there is a very distinct top-down policy that is kind of being forced upon people, and how we need to kind of find ways to overcome that. Going over to what Vanessa said, that the consultation and the need for transparency as far as policy making is going, and as far as policy outcomes are also coming up, it's very important to have that transparency and also initiate a bottom-up approach. Also looking at potential market opportunities. I mean, as individual informal sector market people, accessing opportunities for housing through the open market itself is something that is not enough, and how state really needs to kind of come through and find a balanced approach where it listens to people, where it tries to understand what is the need of the people, and work with finance and manage to kind of provide in an ecosystem which is inclusive, where there is a balance of all different castes and classes of people, where education and healthcare is very important. So it's important that all these different points are kind of part of our larger campaign strategy, which we would like to invite the speakers and the panelists and also the participants to be a part of. On that note, I would like to say thank you very much, all the speakers, Akbar, Karen, Swastik, Vanessa, Vinita, for bringing such very important points of transparency, of consultation, of design, of breaking the whole top-down approach, looking at other options of rents, rentals, etc. to the table. And we really hope that we can take this conversation forward. We will be coming out with a publication of after transcribing the webinar that we've had, and the publication will be mapping the different schemes and policies that has happened, and also other best practices. So we will have the publication, and we hope to take that to the next level, where we will create a campaign strategy at a national level for the aspect of affordable housing, or the working class housing. So thank you very much for being here, for sharing all that you've shared. And I hope to get in touch again soon. Thank you.